Hello and welcome back to a new episode. Today it's a slight divergence from what I was doing previously in order to honor the season. You know, the leaves have changed, there's a chill wind around. You know, it's October, which means it's time, like every other year for the last 4 years, for the Halloween reviews. And this year I thought I would shake things up a little bit. You know, I've done a lot of different things on Halloween over those 4 years, but mostly I've stuck to a comfort zone of, you know, more conventionally gothy artists with a heavy emphasis on 90s industrial metal and Alice Cooper. But this year I thought I would change things a little bit. I'm going to cover some more conventionally goth artists that you might know from the 80s, so you can expect some of those. I'm probably going to do an Alice Cooper video too. I don't know if it's going to be a full-blown review, but also for the first time, I'm going to be covering a spooky album from an artist that really was not spooky at all. And that brings me to the album of the day. The very first album by the Alan Parsons Project, Tales of Mystery and Imagination. Now, why is this a spooky album? Well, it's very simple. It's because it's a concept album about Edgar Allan Poe, only the most goth author to have ever lived. And yeah, I recognize that I'm kind of pushing it a little bit, and you know, this is very debatable, but hey, I've had this album on the brain, and it is connected to the season, so yeah. The Alan Parsons Project were a really interesting group, and I'm going to spend some time talking about what they were, because I think in a lot of ways what the Alan Parsons Project is actually more interesting than any of the music they made, which I do like a lot, probably more than anybody should, especially somebody under 50. But yeah, so the Alan Parsons Project was basically two men. It was Alan Parsons, you know, producer extraordinaire, engineered The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, worked a little bit on Abbey Road when the Beatles were making it, although I think he was like an undersecretary. I think he was like the guy who fetched the tea or something. He was not in a high position at that time. And the other partner was Eric Wolfson, who I believe was a lawyer and part-time songwriter who wrote all the songs, and towards the end of the band's existence kind of took over as lead vocalist. But basically, these two guys got together in the mid-70s after Parsons turned down, because Pink Floyd, of course, loved The Dark Side of the Moon, especially after it sold like as well as it did. And they made him this huge offer that they were going to give him this really sweet deal to produce all of their albums moving forward. And he turned them down because he wanted to do other stuff. And so around that time, he met Wolfson, and they came up with this idea of basically, what if music was like film? What if you had a musical director who wrote all the work and, you know, devised what everything was going to sound like, produced the album and whatnot, and then he brought in various guest performers to work on things, to lay down vocals, play instruments, etc., but while never exactly having a fixed roster. You know, there was no band per se. It would just be a project. And so eventually this evolved into this album, Tales of Mystery and Imagination, which, as I said, is a concept album about Edgar Allan Poe, or taking some of Edgar Allan Poe's most famous stories and applying them to music, sort of giving them the musical treatment. And, you know, this is what Wolfson and Parsons think their realization of those stories would sound like. Now, the thing about this album is that it is not chilling or gothic or spooky, really. It's more like a really schlocky B-movie take on these stories. But because the presentation, for the most part, you know, there is some serious artsy music on here, but for the most part, it's the artsier end of 70s AOR. And so if that's your cup of tea, then this album's going to be great. But yeah. And this, as I understand it, was intended to be a one-off. Very much like the Yellow Magic Orchestra album that I talked about several years ago. I don't think they had a serious intention of continuing this. I think this was just supposed to be a weird curiosity, but as fate would have it, it was pretty commercially successful. So they brought the project back the year after, and from that point on released a slew of albums throughout the late 70s and early 80s that saw the group slowly transition from slightly more songwriting-oriented Pink Floyd sound-alikes to a very interesting but kind of confused 80s synth-pop act who were a lot better than a lot of their peers were in the 80s, but you can still definitely tell why that stuff got forgotten. But anyway, this album is a singular achievement. It's probably their best album, objectively speaking. I don't know if I actually do prefer it, but anyway, I've blathered on enough about it, so let's get into the tracks. So the album opens up with some really cool ambient-y stuff, which eventually develops a really distinctive bass line, before morphing into a very cool instrumental track that has a real Pink Floyd tinge to it, especially in the guitar stuff. I really like it. It's a great way to open up the album. And before I go to the next track, I should also mention, and I can't believe I forgot this from the intro, about a decade after this album was released, Alan Parsons and Eric Wolfson for some reason felt the need to go back and George Lucas up the album. I don't know whether they were following Frank Zappa's lead or what it was, but anyway, they made a bunch of changes, added 80s guitar, some percussion, we made a lot of weird changes to the mix I don't really understand, and just generally screwed around with it. Probably the only good addition is they added some really cool voiceovers from Orson Welles, which you won't hear on the versions of the tracks that I'm playing. So the first real song on the album is, of course, The Raven. Based on the poem of the same name, a classic tale about a narrator consumed by madness that is possibly symbolized in a talking raven that refuses to leave him and just says nevermore. The song features one of the early uses of the vocoder in rock music, which is one of those 70s inventions that got so overused in the 10 to 15 years after its creation that it's hard to imagine how interesting it must have sounded when it was new, because it's just been used by everybody and their brother. But it's still a cool song, and once again, like the intro, there's a lot of repeated motifs in this album, and this introduces several of them. And this is also fantastic, a strong contender for one of the best songs on the album, largely because it features an awesome guest performance from the god of Hellfire himself, Arthur Brown. If you haven't checked this guy out, go do so immediately. His first album, The Crazy World of Arthur Brown, from way back in 1968, is something that you definitely need to hear if you have even the slightest interest in shock rock, or even just late 60s British psychedelia. You won't regret it. Anyway, this is again fantastic. Once again, like every other track on the album, based on the Poe story of the same name. And Brown does a fantastic job of selling the narrator's descent into madness and paranoia over the course of the story as the old man's heart, still beating, mocks him from beneath the floorboards. Cask of Amontillado is fantastic, although I have to admit, some of the lyrics here just go so overboard on the cheese, but the music is good enough that it makes up for it, and it winds up being a great track, especially what with the orchestral bits towards the end, which are just so bombastic and melodramatic and fit the tone the album is going for just perfectly, as well as crossfading into the next track, which is always a plus. The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather is probably the biggest left turn on the album, an upbeat, borderline funk track about what may or may not be one of Edgar Allan Poe's lesser known stories. I had never heard of it when I first found this album, but that doesn't mean anything. A classic story about role reversal, and one of the earliest instances I can think of the trope of the inmates running the asylum. So the next track, which I believe is technically broken down into 4 or 5 separate sub-tracks, is a massive, progressive, classical, whatever, epic, coming in at about 13 to 14 minutes, and chronicling in instrumental form the fall of the House of Usher. A classic story, one of the most interesting and enigmatic pieces that Poe ever wrote, and justifiably something that I think most people know about. It opens up with some genuine 20th century classical stuff. There's some really interesting stuff here that I don't know if I ever actually picked up on the first time around. I have a vague recollection that in the 80s version of this album there's some Orson Welles narration that kind of obscures it, but I also may not have listened to this fully years ago when I first found this album. This whole piece is probably the closest the album ever actually gets to capturing the tone of Poe's work. There's a very gothic and very dramatic feel to a lot of this that fits in well with the sort of dark, mysterious worlds of Poe's writing and the very often depressing and inexplicable circumstances that he recounts in his stories. You really get this sense of what each part of the song represents, whether it's the ominousness of the arrival, the sheer horror of the intermezzo, or the weird mounting tension and buildup of the Pavane track, going into the total cacophony and chaos that is the final part of the piece, signifying the fall of the House of Usher. So the album closes out on this really cool, tranquil, peaceful, but also very wistful note with To One in Paradise. Again, much like Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, this is a story I was not familiar with at all when I first heard this album. I actually don't think it's a story, I think it's a poem, but I could be misremembering that. Either way, it's very pretty, very good, very effective. Kind of an interesting note to end the album on, but I like it a lot, and yeah. Tales of Mystery and Imagination is a very interesting album. There's a pretty solid argument to be made that it's the best album these guys ever put out. It's certainly the one that most fully sort of captures the idea of their original vision, of a project and not a band, that has a sort of unified conceptual theme and to a degree a unified instrumental theme, sharing multiple motifs and whatnot across its runtime. But while also having the sort of diversity and whatnot that you were allowed with a revolving door cast of musicians and performers. This is way more instrumental than they would ever get again, and in general it's just kind of more ambitious. I like it a lot, although its artsiness can sometimes be its downfall, and like I said in the intro, the tone never quite lands the way I think they were trying to have it land. You always get this sort of sleazy, cheesy 70s B-tier horror movie vibe from this album rather than the genuine drama and pathos which I think they were going for. I mean, that being said, I don't actually know a huge amount about what was going on behind the scenes with these guys, largely because I just couldn't find that information out there. So for all I know, they may have deliberately leaned into this and basically said going in, hey, let's make a Hammer horror concept album. But yeah, it's not an album you want to put on if you want to be spooked, but it's an album you could put on if you want to just sort of enjoy a mildly gothic experience on a cool October evening such as this one. But anyway, I will be back very soon with the next Halloween episode, and until then, I will see you guys later.